So we're going to talk about this, goal alignment in the hybrid SharePoint estate. I've got no demos for you. I'm not going to get into deep tech. We're going to keep it quite high level, although the material itself is a little bit heavy. So Dilbert's helped me today and his work colleagues. So there's quite a lot of Dilbert video in this session to help me explain the problems that we're going to have in moving to hybrid. But I'll tell you a little bit about me before we get there. So my name is John Timney. I'm a SharePoint MVP. Oddly, I've been an MVP for about 16 years. It's really quite unusual. Started out as a developer and just kept getting renewed somehow. I don't know how that happens, but it does. I've been in the business about 25 years, and in those 25 years, I've only really worked for large organizations. So most SharePoint systems I'm involved in have at least 100,000, 200,000 users on them. My current system has about 300,000 and 1 million client devices. So it's extremely large scale, probably the biggest SharePoint platform in the world at the minute. I specialize in large-scale enterprise architecture, and I have done some books in the past on various .NET, Java development subjects, SharePoint subjects, and you can find them in good charity bookshops if you look hard enough. And I run the Northeast SharePoint user group as well, so I'm the administrator for that. So if you ever want to come north and talk about something interesting, by all means get in touch. We're always looking for speakers who actually have a clue about what they're talking about, or even want to just give it a go, because they don't know what they're talking about and fancy trying it for the first time. So everybody's welcome. So that's a bit about me. I'm quite organized, so I've got an agenda. As I said, we're going to be about 45 minutes. Depends on how much interaction we get with yourselves. And we're going to look at what this thing is, what goal alignment actually is, really. We're going to look at how we set ourselves up, some of the things we have to consider before we actually head down this murky path into this world of hybrid and stuff. Consider people power, and give you some tips for lining up the right people and how to actually deal with those people as well. And some suggestions on how to keep it real, a framework for creating smart, measurable goals, things you can actually try and work out. Have we achieved something in delivering SharePoint into the business or moving to Azure or something like that? There's a little workshop in the middle of it where I want to get a little bit interactive with you and hopefully try and just show you the difference between goals, objectives, and requirements, because it's quite hard to understand that sometimes. And if all else fails, I'm going to give you some tips on how to deal with corporate monkeys, and something we call drive-by management. But I'm going to let Dilbert help explain that as we move through as well. So SharePoint's a bit of an odd fish to be looking at from a goal alignment perspective, because by the time we actually pick it up, most people have already made the decision that they're going to do SharePoint to some description. But I do want to remember something for this talk. SharePoint isn't the goal. So if somebody comes to you and says, I want SharePoint in our organization, really, you've got my permission to give them a bit of a slap, because it's really the wrong thing to be saying, okay? Goal alignment itself is a very, very real thing. It's a form of governance that you should adopt very early on in trying to actually do any kind of project, not just SharePoint. And it actually comes from enterprise frameworks like TOGAF. Is anybody familiar with TOGAF as a framework? So there's a phase in TOGAF called the preliminary phase, which is the very first phase when you look at something and decide what you're going to do. And within that is, it's really the first aspect of project initiation. It's when you start to think about, what are we going to do? What's our objectives for this particular program or this project? It's where you get to line up things before you actually start. And if you get it wrong here, everything else is going to be wrong further down the line. So it is the most critical aspect of starting any program of work out. And the attention in this preliminary phase is to really get you to take a step back and realign your corporate objectives, your corporate goals, with what you think you might be trying to do when you're looking at things like Azure or SharePoint Online or SharePoint on premises, in fact. And given 63% of all projects that involve SharePoint are in a failure state, it's quite important at this stage that we actually think slightly differently about how we deliver our SharePoint projects successfully, because it's a massive investment that's going to take you years to do. So why wouldn't you stop and take a step back before you actually rush into things? Hence why we're going to focus on this, in fact. So is it that simple? Well, it isn't really, because it's difficult to understand what goals are. Put your hands up if you think you actually know what the difference is between an objective, a goal, and a requirement. Now, I can see you reading this on the board here, which describes what those are. But did you really know what they were before I put that up? It's a challenge, isn't it? It's a difficult thing. So requirements are easily quite the things that can be written down to support the achievement of goals. And that sounds very high level and stuff. Goals are long-term aims. They're the kind of things that your organization needs to do to change the way your business operates or survive as an organization in the next number of years. Now, these are things, requirements are things that you actually want to accomplish. Goals are things you want to accomplish and can contain a set of objectives to help you get to those goals. And objectives are very concrete things. The things you can measure, right? The things you can commit to. And they often involve a number of steps. So the objective might be to install SharePoint. There are a number of steps involved in installing SharePoint. But that isn't really a requirement. A requirement is never really to install SharePoint, is it? People will list a requirement out as, I want to do something specific, like store documents. That's a requirement, but installing SharePoint is not a requirement, it's an objective. You must install SharePoint to actually store documents. Do you understand the difference? It's confusing, isn't it? So we can measure objectives really quite easily. I want 100 users on SharePoint Online by this December. It's very easy to measure that. Did we get 100 users online in SharePoint Online by December? If you didn't, you haven't met your objective. If you wanted to expose SharePoint Online to the extranet by December, have you done that? Well, that's a requirement to expose the extranet to end users by December. So you have this kind of confusion between requirements, objectives, and goals, which sometimes gets the better of us when we're thinking about SharePoint, because most of us very quickly get down into the depths and start thinking about requirements. We have a problem to solve, therefore we will solve it by putting SharePoint in. We want to store documents, therefore we will try and get SharePoint online without even understanding what the impact on the rest of the business might be. So, is it something we can easily describe? Because you've seen from the last slide, it's a little bit confusing, isn't it? Let's ask Dilbert. He'll explain it better. Sound. Sound. Volume is on the laptop. Demo gods, and I haven't even got a demo. Can you believe it? Shall I take it off and stick my mic on it? Well, this is going to make it a challenging talk. It's an enterprise architecture framework. So it's really a series of steps and guidance and rules and ways of documenting programs to make it a more holistic viewpoint of what you're trying to do within the organization. So it helps you change the nature of the business itself, not just do something like SharePoint. So. Is it working now? Yeah?
No. It should be coming to your laptop.
You took it out. How's there no volume on it? Volume's up max. Apologies, guys. We're having a little bit of that's why. So it was 45 minutes. It might now be 50 minutes by the time we get finished. Yeah.
Wardrobe closet that leads to a magical world of preposterous businesses.
Tell you what, why don't we just run that again, yeah? So where were we? Okay, so we were just about to get Dilbert to help us actually understand what goal alignment was, weren't we? So now we've got some sound, we'll carry on. Forget that blip.
I need help making unrealistic assumptions to support a business case for a bad idea.
Easy. There's a hole in the back of our wardrobe closet that leads to a magical world of preposterous business assumptions.
We don't have a wardrobe closet.
Assume we do.
So this is the world that we're faced with, isn't it? A world full of complete assumptions. And goal alignment really is just a method of business thinking for evaluating our client requirements to help us align those things to SharePoint requirements that help us align those things to much wider strategic objectives to help us deliver on those goals. So it sounds complicated, doesn't it? It sounds very consultancy speak. But it does stop us failing before we actually begin our project by allowing us to take that step back and consider what the organization needs, not just we as the people who are trying to do our SharePoint projects think that we should give the organization as solution. That's often the wrong thing. SharePoint's pretty much a platform for holistic business change. It enables us to give business change to the organization if we think about it the right way, doesn't it? And we can easily take what we have as objectives and align that thinking to things like Azure, cloud-first strategy, for example. Is SharePoint involved in a cloud-first strategy? Well, really, you should be thinking we're trying to get off all of our internal systems to the cloud. That's really what the goal of a cloud-first strategy is. And we don't really think about SharePoint as being a member of a cloud-first strategy, or do we? Who thinks SharePoint's part of a cloud-first strategy? It's confusing, isn't it? Still very consultancy, isn't it? So, as I pointed out, 63% of SharePoint projects in this year's AIM survey are in a bit of a failure state. And the main reasons given are really a lack of support from senior management, inadequate end-user training, and poor upfront planning. Poorly defined objectives, no strategic goals are fairly endemic in these kind of failing SharePoint platforms. Most of our projects, and some of you in this room will almost certainly be guilty of this, go from concept to run in a really quick succession. So you decide you want to do SharePoint, or you decide you want to use Azure, and next thing you know, somebody's built something. You've not really thought about the context of it, but somebody's built something. It's become a fairly mission-critical part of your system, and people are using it. And nobody really understands why you did it in the first place, other than somebody in IT or somebody who had a bit of budget decided they were going to go ahead with it. So it's really quite critical, in fact, that we kind of step back, and before we start implementing SharePoint on the cloud, tapping into very bizarre, odd services that we sign up for without really understanding them, but could bring our business to its knees if we suddenly push all of our critical systems into this without understanding what they do. It's really important that we actually learn a bit more about those things, isn't it, before we start doing something like SharePoint. And yet most of us immediately rush for installations, sign up for SharePoint Online, get a demo system, build something in Azure, before we even understand what we need to do as an organization. And projects that do goal alignment well are the ones that are not in the 63% of the ones that are failing, to be fair. So why should we do this, really? Because I still think it sounds very complex. Now, does anybody really understand what this is so far? Because that's really quite confusing, isn't it? Now, if we can't understand it, and we're the people who are responsible for delivering this in an organization, isn't that endemic of the problem of why SharePoint projects are in such a failure state? Because we don't really understand what goals are, what objectives might be, and yet we're going to use these things to solve our business requirements, and yet we're sat here and we still don't understand it, and I've done everything I could to explain it there. It's very confusing, isn't it? Especially for the last session on Tuesday, when you've already been through a load of technical sessions to begin with. We should have done this in the morning. Let's ask Carol. Carol actually really understands this.
Carol, schedule a staff meeting.
What's the topic?
I plan to fuse Six Sigma with lean methods to eliminate the gap between our strategy and our objectives.
I'll just say, waste of time.
So Carol really gets this right. Goal alignment, the only reason we do goal alignment is to stop us wasting time. Because time itself is very, very expensive. I'm very time short. I'm sure most of you are time short as well. It's a very scarce thing in our lives these days. We're very busy people. It helps us understand the value of using SharePoint to initiate business change, rather than SharePoint itself being the value that we're actually trying to deliver. SharePoint's just a platform. It's just a piece of software. That's all it is. It doesn't bring anything other than an opportunity. Goal alignment actually bridges the gap between different members of the organization that you actually work for, different clients, different stakeholders, and helps you understand their needs and their requirements. And Virgil talked about a lot of this in the last session that we've just had in this room, about understanding what the end user needs are, not just what the corporate director's needs might be. But goal alignment also stops hidden agendas by servicing much more realistic goals. Why do you want to move to SharePoint Online? What business benefits are there from using Azure for your organization specifically? Why would you try and do hybrid in your organization? Why would you do that in the first place? Why would you even consider it if there's nothing wrong with your business now? If your business is working perfectly, why would you look at these things? Well, the reasons for why you might do that are all the things that relate to goals in the future, how your organization needs to evolve. But the most critical thing this does is it actually helps justify spend, because hybrid is very expensive. And as much as Microsoft might tell you SharePoint Online is cheap, it isn't. And as much as they might tell you Azure is easy to work with, and you can bring a website up in 2 minutes using Azure's website builder tools and technologies, it's not easy to do at all. It's very expensive and very cumbersome, which means you have to think strategically about what do we do with our staff when we face them all with this brand new set of technology that they've never been faced with before. So it allows us to take a step back, justify the spend, and think differently about how our organization is going to change. And there are some really quite simple things that we can do to set ourselves up for doing good goal alignment, good goal planning. For example, we have to invest in time to stop us wasting time, which sounds a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? But again, Virgil mentioned this in the last the talk. We have to give people the time to understand what problems in the business they're going to try and solve by bringing something like SharePoint to the table. And it doesn't matter whether it's on premises, in the cloud, built by a third party. What problems are you really going to solve for your organization? And hybrid's a really classic example of this, because people go out and sign up for SharePoint Online without realizing what it doesn't give them in comparison to SharePoint on premises. Now, just a little poll in the audience. Put your hands up if you've read the SLA for SharePoint Online. That's about the average response we get. It's usually me and somebody else, so there's a couple of people in the audience, a very small percentage who've read the SLA for SharePoint Online. Has any of you in the room signed up for SharePoint Online? Only the person who's read the SLA. Well, well done. Was there a hand at the back as well? Yeah? So a couple of people. When do we ever read service level agreements for things before we go and sign up for them? You don't really, do you? You go and look at it when it fails. So, I mean, the other side of this is where you install SharePoint on premises without actually working out what business problem we're going to solve. Who's got an on-premises SharePoint implementation? It's everybody. Do you understand what business problem it solves? 1, 2, 3. So, but there's a room here with quite a few people in, a lot more than 3, who understand what business problem you're trying to solve with SharePoint. Because we tend to do it as a technology solution, isn't it? So these are fairly critical steps I'm going to take you through to help you understand and prepare, in fact, for doing better goal alignment than you've been doing in the past. And critically, these things are really about aligning yourselves to the wider organizational strategy. So if we recognize that we need to understand corporate strategy, and we have to constantly align to that, can we do SharePoint by keeping that in the back of our mind? When everyone's telling us we need this requirement solved, we need this problem dealt with, we have this thing that we need delivered and done by this deadline. Can we actually align to strategy when we do that?
All companies need a strategy so the employees will know what they don't do.
Uh-oh. What should I do? Uh-huh. We don't do that.
So strategies are sometimes a little bit, do we really need to know anything about that? Do you think it's important to understand what your corporate strategy is? A fairly recent survey by a group called Metris actually identified that in pretty much every organization, only about 14% of people have any concept of what their corporate strategy is. Do you know what your corporate strategy is? Put your hand up if you do. So a couple of hands have gone up. Are you self-employed? Most of us don't really know what the corporate strategy is. More importantly, we don't know what value it brings to the organization by having that strategy. So it's very hard for us to get on board, and specifically for the people we might want to involve in our SharePoint hybrid projects, to get on board with thinking at that strategic level. What benefit is it to them to be involved in this much more complex strategic thinking about requirement gathering, objective setting, goal alignment. And you have to kind of know what you're doing to drive that strategy. And I wonder how many of us in this audience are actually a little bit guilty of these things in our SharePoint projects. So we don't understand what the strategy is, but we neither have any measurements for success. We haven't actually worked out what the success criteria is for what we're doing in SharePoint. How many of you have success criteria drafted and outlined to allow you to say, you know what, our project's finished, it's done, we've done it. So again, very, very small number. Who's, sorry? Kind of. We'll get to that. I'll show you the difference in a short while. Just bear with me. So who's linked aspects of SharePoint to specific business functions? So HR have their own specific use of SharePoint. So they have their own use cases, and you know the staff canteen has a different set of use cases. So you're doing that kind of thing. Who identified champions in the organization to go out and bestow the virtues of SharePoint? Or talk to the business about why we might want to use Azure in the next 12 months as part of a wider strategy on cloud enablement, for example. Who did that? So we've got another hand, one hand, one hand, one hand we tend to be seeing here. Who took the success of the work that you're doing to HR to talk to HR about how you would be rewarded for doing a good job and helping change your business? So again, we've got one hand. You know? And the typical kind of answer you get, isn't it? You told you to get lost. So there are things that we have to do on there. And one of them actually is that we've got to stop talking like consultants. And as a consultant, that's a bit of a difficult thing to say, isn't it? So
We need 3 more programmers.
Use agile programming methods.
Agile programming doesn't just mean doing more work with fewer people.
Find me some words that do mean that and ask again.
So we kind of have to be careful of conversations at this early phase of trying to think about hybrid or SharePoint online or connecting systems together. We've got to be careful of thinking about engaging in things about nimble, agile, scrum, experience-led design. What I've found on projects that really go wrong big scale is that we use these as excuses for not doing proper project governance and planning, for not doing proper project documentation, bypassing the very early phases of governance and planning and quality control. And instead, we plow into building components, installing SharePoint, signing up for SharePoint Online, working out how we connect it up to our internal system. And then the guy who did it all leaves the company, and nobody has any idea how it was connected together, what the documentation looks like, because we did it in an agile way, or we were nimble in our delivery, or we did paired programming to build a component quicker because we had to get that delivered by a certain deadline. In fact, one of the largest and most in-demand skills in the market at the minute is actually people with experience of waterfall-led design. That's become a bit of a shortage skill these days, people who understand the concepts of waterfall. But we all work in a world where SharePoint and the things we do around it tend to be much more agile now. Who's working in agile? Who's doing scrum? And we do, don't we? Are you doing scrum? I'll put you on the spot. Are you doing your documentation at the end of it?
Not pure, some elements.
So some elements, yeah. So you're trying to get the most out of it. So we also have to watch out for these kind of nonsense phrases that we have, haven't we? And ignore them all. Stuff like tip of the sword, catalyst for change, transformation, and my all-time favorite, low-hanging fruit. Let's pick the low-hanging fruit and deliver that first. What does that actually mean? How can you even measure anything like that? Low-hanging fruit. It doesn't make any sense, does it? But consultants like me actually use these kind of phrases all the time. The word effectively is my biggest bugbear. It's just a filler. It means nonsense, doesn't it? So, and of course, it isn't just consulting where we have this language problem that doesn't help with goal alignment. Here's an example just from the kind of things that we see on TV these days. So instead of talking about things having to happen promptly, it must happen instantly. It's much easier to talk about, it's much better, more powerful to talk about burning fat than losing weight. Nothing to do with IT, nothing to do with consultancy. And we don't have large problems anymore, do we? We have massive ones these days because it seems to be more impactful, doesn't it? And this is just another example of consultant speak that we come across all the time that detracts us from what the goals are that we're actually trying to think about in our organization. This language isn't helpful. And people become a bit of a problem as well when you're trying to look at goal alignment as well, because SharePoint projects specifically live or die by the people that are actually involved in them. And we're in a world that's desperately short of credible SharePoint staff. So desperately short, we just cannot find the staff. In a hybrid world where technology is actually moving at such a pace that few of us can actually keep up with the demand, by the end of this year, there's going to be 7 million unfulfilled jobs in the world with the word cloud in the title. By the end of this year, we can't keep pace with the demand any longer. But people are also our greatest asset as well when we're trying to think about changing our business by using products like SharePoint or products like SharePoint Online and Hybrid. But you have to set some ground rules when you're trying to work with people. Lift ourselves up from the grass and stop thinking about the requirements of SharePoint specifically and think about the wider organization by setting the rules.
Chapter 4, Time Management. Always postpone meetings with time-wasting morons.
How do you do that?
Can I get back to you on that?
I use that one quite often, actually. So, when we're dealing with people, if there isn't any budget set aside for people to do this advanced research into things like Azure, into SharePoint Online, into Hybrid, into, in fact, new technologies that are emerging, understanding what Metalogix provides, understand what AvePoint might provide, what these other tool vendors might give you and bring to the table. How can we justify demanding people's time if we're not setting budget aside? And yet we still expect everybody to know what the third-party market's like, what Azure does, what SharePoint Online does. Who's had training this year? This is it. This is it. And often programs don't actually choose the right stakeholders, do they? Many have a vested interest in status quo. The guy who runs your open text platform probably doesn't want to see SharePoint as a success in the organization, does he? Because his job and his team are likely to be either disbanded or farmed off into something new. So people like status quo, don't they? And you as well. I mean, what I often find is people take a back seat. When actually, if you're in a meeting with me, your opinion counts a lot. I can tell a lot of how the program's going by how you're feeling about your work and what's being delivered and stuff. Sometimes programs just are generally successful because the people who work on them work so well together that they make the program a success regardless of what the objectives are, regardless of what the goals are, regardless of the requirements. Somehow, they just make it all work, don't they? And that's people power coming together. But if you don't join in and take part like that, what right do you have to say, told you that wasn't going to work, I knew that wasn't a good idea? Which is something we all do after the fact, isn't it? Once something goes wrong, we're all guilty of saying, knew that wasn't going to work, but you didn't go, hey, that's not going to work. Don't do that. Don't start down that path. And remember, the project manager's job is to deliver to deadlines, but not at any cost. And quite often, we let the quality go. We compromise on things to hit a deadline to make sure we're seen as delivering something and keeping the project moving forward, aren't we? So these are really quite useful rules that you can work with people to help your project moving forward and give people time to take part, because we're all under pressure for time, aren't we? And you need the right people, of course. And how do we identify who those people are?
My project has been infected by attractive people. As you know, attractive people are unproductive. The problem is compounded when you put several of them in the same room. They've already started to pair off. I've got 4 love triangles and 6 divorces. All of my status reports say, and I quote, "Dude, I can't concentrate now." My plan is to replace each attractive person with something like this, or this.
He thinks I'm productive.
So it's not really the ugly people, is it, in the organization who we want to be working with? It might be. I'm not the most attractive guy, but I do my best. It's actually a different set of people, isn't it? It's subject matter experts. Who's a SharePoint SME in here? Who claims to be a subject matter expert? I've worked with SharePoint since Microsoft actually bought the company up that invented it in the first place. I wouldn't claim to be an SME. I know a lot about SharePoint, I know a lot about business, but I wouldn't claim to be a subject matter expert. That's not the people you want. The people you want to are the SMEs, are the people who understand how your organization functions, what they do day to day to deliver things for your business, not things around SharePoint. We get confused and lost in the grass. We get confused about that. What business processes are we going to change by putting SharePoint in? They're the subject matter experts that we need to be speaking to. It's the current users of systems. It's the people in the know, isn't it, who we really want to be speaking to. Is it the business sponsor? Might be. They might know an awful lot more than the CEO does about putting SharePoint in. But the CEO should really know an awful lot about strategy of the organization. And these things tend to go hand in hand. You've also got to choose quite wisely as well, because every person actually costs money. You know, consultants are very expensive, and quite often we have to bring consultants in because we just don't have those skills. You have to pick your consultancy even quite wisely as well, because a lot of consultancies in the market haven't got a clue about hybrid, haven't got a clue about SharePoint Online really. They're still learning while they go. But because they use lots of consultant speak and lots of those words we mentioned earlier, you can get drawn into this. We will use a third-party consultancy because they know what they're talking about. Listen to them. They're using all the right words. Doesn't mean they know what they're doing. There's also no point asking users who don't know what they want to tell you what they want. If they don't get strategy, or they don't understand SharePoint, Azure, or SharePoint Online, how can you take a conversation out to the end users in your business and expect them to tell you how the business needs to change to move forward for the next few years and how SharePoint might help them change the business? It's difficult, isn't it? Told you it was a heavy session for the end of the day. And then just when you think you've actually got all the right people, you have to bring in something called the 10th man strategy. Has anybody actually heard of the 10th man strategy before? So this is the guy that companies bring in that seems to be very annoying because he's sat at a corporate table with you lot who are planning this project, and everything you say you're going to do, he disagrees with.
The three pillars of our pyramid are communication, integrity, and teamwork.
Question: since when do pyramids have pillars?
Answer: shut up.
Problem? All of my team members are idiots. If I communicate my honest opinion of their ideas, I won't be a team player. But if I pretend to agree with their bad ideas, I won't have integrity. So instead of being a pyramid, can I be a two-legged stool like you?
Wow, that was much better than my pillar question.
Aren't I on your team?
So most armies use the 10th man strategy to avoid something called groupthink. And groupthink happens when we end up sat around meeting tables thinking that we've got the strategy right and nobody disagrees. Often because it's actually easier to sit there and not say anything because we might get an action. So we tend to fall into this general tacit acceptance of group thinking because nobody really understands what they're talking about in relation to this. Therefore, it's easier just to sit and say, when everybody should be going, and that's groupthink. So what we should do is actually bring in credible enterprise architects who actually can help you be that 10th man, who can actually interject with your ideas and say, you know what, I think that's not really such a good idea. That isn't going to help your corporate strategy. That's not going to help you as a business move forward. Or tell me how that will help you move forward when everybody's sitting, agreeing to the corporate strategy changes that you're going to make. And it just doesn't work. And a lack of 10th man strategy actually causes really ineffective goals. Not everybody in a room should always agree with what everybody agrees with. Sounds very contradictory, doesn't it? But it's true. This is really good for stopping things like World War Z type outcomes. Did you ever see, has anybody seen the film World War Z? So in the film World War Z, everybody said there could never be a zombie outbreak that would take over the world. Everybody. Completely fantasy that this could ever happen. But the Israelis decided that they would invoke the 10th man strategy and they will build a giant wall around one of their cities, just in case. And of course, World War Z broke out, zombies invaded the earth, and the whole of the population was decimated except for this little pocket of people inside this walled city in Israel who stood there and went, told you so. We knew that. We knew this strategy wasn't a good idea. We knew SharePoint was never going to work. We knew moving to SharePoint Online was going to bring down our company. You should have thought about that. We thought about that. So how do we keep it grounded? Because it's very easy, isn't it, to get too overtaken by this whole strategic thing, isn't it? This whole goal alignment thing. And lose track of the sight that really what we want to do is put SharePoint in. Because that's kind of what we do, that's our job. And really all we want is a bit of document management, isn't it? And there's not much more to it. So how do we keep it grounded rather than kind of selling out and accepting SharePoint itself as the goal, when really it should be about business change? Well, it's important that you make it personal. I mentioned talking to HR earlier, when only one person said they talked to HR, and HR said, go away. It's actually quite important to get HR involved in conversations.
How can I achieve my full potential?
You already have.
What?
Seriously, you've already peaked.
I came to human resources for some guidance.
That's what tipped me off.
So it's quite important to get HR involved because most of what we do involves performance appraisals. Most of the things that we're going to do in relation to hybrid, in relation to SharePoint Online and Azure, are going to involve really quite significant changes to our business. Why would you not want HR to understand how important those significant changes are to your business? Why would you not have those conversations with them? You should also be publishing what people say. So all of those meetings I mentioned earlier, those 10th man conversations, that consensus of opinion, if you agree to something, you work in my company, my project, that's going to be on a poster on the wall. Brian said this was going to happen by this date. And this is actually what I do. I will put your commitments up on a poster on the wall so everybody can see what's coming down the line and what's being delivered by the business, what changes we expect to see coming along. Might go in Yammer, might go on the intranet, but we will publish what people say. We'll take your commitment to projects, to SharePoint, to the strategic change in the business and make it public. So we'll make you accountable for it. Who's accountable for the SharePoint delivery in your company at the minute? So there's a couple of you who have actually got the responsibility for it. Do you make the people who work for you publicly accountable for the things that you are expected to deliver? Why don't you? Why wouldn't you do it? You do it. Yeah. But inside, yeah, you make people accountable. It's a really good technique for actually making sure that people are very communicative and very informed about what's going on when you're looking at these strategic changes. And how do you motivate people? Well, I mean, a classic example on somebody who wants a cloud-first strategy for their organization is opportunities around home working. So who's a home worker? Who wishes they were a home worker? So wouldn't we all like more time working from home? And of course, this brings with it brand new opportunities for things like home working. Who'd have thought delivering SharePoint would change the way our business potentially functions, reduces the operating costs of the business by reducing office space, and gives us much more potential time back for not having to travel to the office every day because we now can access all of our facilities from home. And it's a different way of thinking about the strategic implementation of SharePoint. The goal now for this cloud-first strategy, actually, there are benefits to doing this now. That's very different, isn't it? Benefits for the end users, benefits to the people. Who'd have dared it? That's shocking. And we've got to watch for really quite poor goal definition as well. So that cloud-first strategy is a classic example of something which is almost impossible to measure, in fact. And stating a goal doesn't make it a good goal or even a valid requirement. What's the worst requirement you've ever heard? Throw one at me. Somebody at the back. I would like workflow. Classic. So what does that mean? I would like workflow. It doesn't make any sense, does it? But it's the kind of requirement you get, isn't it? I had a requirement from a client this week when I was evaluating their document for moving to SharePoint Online, for moving all of their on-premises systems, that they wanted page responses within 10 seconds for SharePoint Online. They hadn't read the SLA. You can't get a page response guarantee from Microsoft within 10 seconds, which meant that they're not going to be able to go to tender to actually get a supplier to fill this because there's no way a supplier is going to sign up to guarantee a page response from SharePoint Online within 10 seconds. So we have to be careful with these things, haven't we? People will give us what they believe are valid requirements. They'll give us, in fact, what they believe are valid goals. Cloud-first strategy, better communication. And these things can't be delivered, can they?
Everything you do is different from the way I would do it. That's how I know you're doing everything wrong. I wouldn't be making that face.
So people are going to give you opinion, and that doesn't make it fact. Requirements, are they good goals to aim for? Well, they're not really goals, are they? They're requirements. And we have to try and segregate what a requirement is from what a goal is. Here's some examples from when Microsoft actually released SharePoint 2007. And we call these things platitudes. They're valueless phrases. How would we measure whether or not we had better communication? How would we measure whether we had document management? I'm sure you've got document management, haven't you? What does improved compliance actually mean? It's a bit like saying we need workflow, isn't it? And of course, SharePoint 2007 came with improved auditing capabilities as well. And much more realistic would have been to have said, hey, SharePoint, great system. We can use it to identify if people are actually online so we can communicate with them in real time. Or to say something like, hey, SharePoint, great system. It can do version control on documents to allow you to track them, maintain them, update them, and see who's changed them. Or we can do things like, we can apply policies on records. What a fantastic system. Policy control on records. Or should we really be saying, actually, we need a records management strategy as a company? Or we need a voice over IP strategy, because instant messaging somebody isn't really what we need. Or do we need corporate file planning strategies in our company instead? Because really that's what those things are about. Better communication. Do we need voice over IP as an organization? Can we get better communication from SharePoint? Who thinks we get better communication out of SharePoint? Anybody? And yet these are the virtues that Microsoft sold that product on. Quite difficult, isn't it? And we need to make sure that what we actually seek is really quite achievable. Or how many of you in the past have been faced with really what was an impossible thing to do? Who's ever been asked to deliver something where you thought, I've got no chance of ever being able to do that. Why am I starting down this path? Usually we get more hands up when we ask that one.
You have failed to meet a goal set by our CEO.
Do you mean the impossible goal, the ill-advised one, or the one you didn't tell me about? I figured out what's wrong with life. It's other people.
So we'll just take a little interactive workshop here now, right? What I'm going to give you here is a set of requirements that were given to me by clients. So let's just have a bit of a work through these. There's only about 6 of them, isn't there? So a client said to me, got me in the office and said, I need to organize content. I spend so much time trying to locate stuff. What does that mean? Be brave, speak out. What does that mean? Sorry? So he's disorganized. What do we do with SharePoint? So what Walter also said was, I need SharePoint. So what does it mean? Could be surveys. I mean, could be mentions organizing content. So do we want access to the content organizer in there? Spend so much time trying to locate stuff? Is it a problem with search? Is it that people have their stuff on their hard drives? It's got nothing really to do with where the information's kept. Nobody really has any idea where it is in the business to start with. Not really if it's in a central location. And yet they want SharePoint for this. Is that a good requirement? Is that a good goal or an objective? What do you think? Could you deliver that? It's too open-ended, isn't it? Far too open-ended. So when we got into the crux of this, what they really meant was, you know what, we've got no file plan, and we don't have any naming conventions in our company. So before we got anywhere near SharePoint, what they really needed was an information architecture, which helped them understand where their information was going to be. They needed a strategy to help them define information management, and as part of that, they needed information architecture because they had no controls on where people kept documents. Most of the documents actually sat on people's laptops. That's probably why they couldn't find most of these things. They had a very mobile workforce. Try another one. So I need to be able to find content. The report I want to locate is not the right one. I don't know who wrote it or who owns the report. So again, what does this tell you? So to start off, he needs to be able to find content, so they're struggling to actually discover where things are kept. The report I want to locate is not the right one. Why would you want to locate something that's not the right thing? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Yeah? I don't know who wrote it. Well, so they've kind of got a vague idea of something that's in their system somewhere that has some information that they need access to. Or who owns the report. They don't really know who wrote it or who owns it, but it's got something in they need access to, but they don't think it's the right report they want to locate. It doesn't make any sense, does it? But they needed SharePoint to solve this problem for them. Now, I kind of questioned this one again. You know, this was a company who didn't have any concept whatsoever of metadata. None. They didn't know what metadata was. Or what value it might bring to being able to build a search-based solution. So, pretty much like the previous company, because it was a different company, they had no concept of information architecture or information management.
But those requirements, I'm pretty sure that those requirements were wrote by users. So for users, it's very good requirements because they know they at least can explain to you what their problem is.
Yes,
and
I mean,
you can help them to build those goals rather than sometimes you just even can't, they can't even explain what they want, what they're not happy with. So this is, if we say that those requirements produced by users, they're really good. I mean I'm very...
so are you saying they were good requirements by users?
For users, yes.
Yeah, because these all came from the chief information officers of every one of these companies.
Because they can explain what they're not happy with. And then
Yes.
you can
I-
help them formulate that in a way
Indeed, indeed. So here's the third one.
to set up goals, etc. So
I need to store content. My stuff is classified. It needs to be secured. Stuff needs approval first, though. I want SharePoint. So what does that mean? I need to store content. Do they want document libraries? I mean, is that a good starting point candidate for this? My stuff's classified. Does that mean I can put it in SharePoint online? Do I need to build this in Azure? Am I worried about stuff like data domicile, privacy issues? Making sure Microsoft staff are correctly cleared? It needs to be approved. Stuff needs approved first. Does that mean I want access to something like SharePoint's approval mechanism? Or is it an off-site approval before we even get near to putting stuff in a system that we might generate in the future to solve these kind of problems? But I want SharePoint. Can I have SharePoint so I can do these things? Is really how the questions went. So what do you think these guys needed? It's a regulated industry, this client. They actually needed a fairly significant information rights management strategy and information about how they would actually do things like backups, off-site backups, and the transit of data between different locations and services. Nothing to do with SharePoint. And yet, if we put SharePoint in, I'm sure we could tap into the information rights management strategy that the organization had built before we actually started implementing SharePoint. But without putting that strategy in place first, there was no point doing SharePoint because they wouldn't have got any benefits from it whatsoever. All it would have given them was a place to store documents with none of the things they were actually asking for. So I want access to my documents from home and from another country. So what do you think that is? What are they asking for? I want SharePoint. What are they asking for? So a VPN. Anything else? OneDrive for Business, perhaps? Is that a solution to something like this? Do they want access to SharePoint Workspace so they can take stuff offline and stick it on their laptops? Well, actually, this was a company who were actually seeking a cloud-first strategy. And they were looking to enable home working for their workers. But they didn't know how to articulate that. All they said was, well, we want SharePoint online. Because they envisaged having SharePoint online as being the panacea for home working. Because suddenly, all of their stuff could be in the cloud, and it could be accessible from anywhere in the world, just with an internet connection. But that's not really how they articulated this, really, is it? And of course, to take that to something like SharePoint Online, we have to completely think differently about the goal. The goal isn't to have access to documents from home and from another country. That's just a requirement. The goal is to actually have some sort of cloud-first strategy that enables us to deliver an objective of home working, isn't it? Is it getting a little bit clearer? Yeah? Try a different one. So what's this one? I want to be able to email my documents and know they will end up in the right storage location. I want SharePoint. So what does that mean? I want to be able to email my documents. Well, it sounds more like Exchange, surely. I want to mail my documents in. But we know that SharePoint has the ability and capability to have document email-enabled libraries, don't we? You can see we're all reaching immediately for solutions here, aren't you? Because they give you the requirement and we instantly start thinking, well, what's the solution to this particular problem? Well, we're not really thinking, well, what's the context of what they're really trying to do? So this was a company who had a bit of a problem with their platform strategy. Didn't really have anything to do with SharePoint. So they had multiple systems that could receive emails, like Lotus Notes, Documentum, things like this. But they were all disparate repositories. So when something was emailed in, it ended up somewhere, nobody knew where it had gone. Because it got sent to one email address and people didn't really understand that sending to that email address meant it went into Documentum. Sending it to Exchange meant it went into somebody's either group folder or private folder, or sending it to Lotus Notes meant it went in one of any 60 different Lotus Notes servers. So they couldn't find the content. What they really wanted was a strategy to consolidate their multiple disparate platforms into one centralized platform service. So they knew when they emailed documents in, it actually went through a specific set of content routing into their system, which was centralized. And they said, well, we want SharePoint. But they had no concept of putting SharePoint in wasn't going to get rid of all of these other systems and where all the other documents were actually located. So on top of that, they also needed to think, what's our long-term migration strategy look like? What is our goal around migration strategies and the consolidation of platform technology? So it's very easy to be drawn into immediately thinking of solutions for SharePoint when somebody gives us a set of requirements that vaguely relate to SharePoint. But we have to lift ourselves out of that when we're thinking about Azure and SharePoint Online and integrated and hybrid systems, because it's much more expensive to get these things wrong. If you don't analyze the requirements and we end up with the wrong solution to that requirement, we've already spent a significant amount of money and we're nowhere near getting the right strategy for the business. The goals will never be met. I wish I had a way for my employees in the field to get in touch with each other cheaply. This is the last one. So the answer was buy him a mobile phone. The guy said, well, we need SharePoint for this. We think we can use SharePoint to get in touch with our employees cheaply. And I was a bit intrigued by this one. It was like, well, what do you mean by that? How are you going to use SharePoint to do this? And actually, you're not far off the problem. The problem was they had very old mobile phone technologies in their company. And they'd actually looked at what SharePoint can give you in terms of the mobile views and said, you know what, we want SharePoint, because it'll allow us to have mobile views on our phones, on the old Nokia phones they had, which weren't smartphones. And they ended up having to spend £100,000 uplifting everybody's organizational mobile phones to get them in a position where they could then think about moving to a technology that they could actually access via mobile phones. So the requirements as presented are not goals. Yeah? This is the big difference between goal alignment and requirement capture. Yeah? Goal alignment's about organizational strategy. And we have to ask, if we had these kind of things, what benefits do we get from them? It's impossible to work out what the benefit of this is. I wish I had a way for my employees in the field to get in touch with it cheaply. We can't work out what the benefit from that is. It's just too vague a statement, isn't it? There's no holistic requirement there. There's no holistic oversight to look down on what the business needs in that respect. So we're getting a little bit closer, I hope, to understanding what goal alignment is. And it still is quite confusing. But you need to watch for these platitudes I mentioned earlier.
Alice, you're the first recipient of the motivational Stone of Quality. It cost $1,000 to have it engraved, It's my way of saying thanks.
There's no weapon, but I found this cool motivational rock.
So platitudes are things that carry no value for us. They don't help us with our goals either. So if we took a phrase like, your COO comes to you and says, we want, within the next 5 years, to have a world-leading collaboration system. Could you really deliver that? A world-leading collaboration system. And yet it's a common phrase that we hear often. So if somebody says to you something that kind of sounds like a bit of a vague requirement, it doesn't really sound like anything like world-leading collaboration, you can stick it in this kind of sentence and read it back. So what would world-leading collaboration look like to you? What would a cloud-first strategy look like? What, in fact, would SharePoint Online look like to you if we delivered that? What aspects should we consider with this initiative to deliver SharePoint Online? If you had SharePoint Online, how would things be different in the future than they are today? And if the person asking for the tech can't tell you that, it's a bit of a platitude. They haven't really thought it out good enough. They haven't put enough time in up front. They haven't done that preliminary analysis to actually work out what the business benefit would be. And whenever we try and do something new, we come across this thing called the reluctant populace. And it doesn't matter whether you're trying to integrate Azure in with your on-premises platforms, if you're trying to push half of your population to SharePoint Online, putting a fruit machine in the cafe, somebody's going to object, aren't they, because they can.
Book some one-on-one meetings for me so I can practice my new dismissive scoffing sound.
And then, I think we should... Ooh, I like what you've done with your dismissive scoffing sound.
20% more spittle.
So people are going to object just because they can. And you've got to understand that when you're trying to do projects like SharePoint, people will object for no other reason than they're in a position to do that. If enough people object to what you're trying to do, this becomes the reluctant populace. And if you can't control those objections, your project will just die on its knees. It will fail because you'll not get enough buy-in behind it to actually push it forward any longer. So if you start knowing that people are going to be reluctant, how do you work out how to gain their confidence to start with? How do you get them to take part in identifying these real business benefits that we're trying to seek from these rather vague requirements that we're often presented with? And turn things into really quite measurable goals and things that we can deliver that bring the business benefits. And talking about benefits, of course, we've got to make sure that what we deliver is measurable. Goals themselves are very difficult to measure. Strategy itself is a very difficult thing to actually measure and tick off as having been something that we deliver. It's not the same as delivering a requirement where we can say, we did that. Changing the strategy of an organization, moving to cloud first, enabling Azure as part of a new platform strategy is very hard to actually measure.
This is how it is. I need to use up my budget before the end of the year, or else I'll get less next year. So I'll be flexible about approving expenses for a few days. Wink, wink.
Nice coffee-holding panda.
You should see the one that isn't pregnant.
So, we shouldn't spend for the wrong reasons, should we? And we should probably all know that by now. Everything we do, SharePoint projects specifically, because that's where we work, should do one of these things. You should either increase the profits of the organization, reduce the cost of the operating cost of the organization, or reduce the debt of your company. If it isn't doing one of those three things, it should remove the constraints to allow you to do one of those three things. If you can't identify whether or not you are getting one of those benefits from doing hybrid, SharePoint on-premise, SharePoint online, Azure, you shouldn't be doing it. Plain and simple, because it means you haven't got your goals aligned. And even when you're doing your absolute best to gather these realistic goals, start your project well, identifying benefits, get the right staff, those people actually understand strategy, they're aligning to that strategy, doing what they're right, you've got the right stakeholder buy-in, people will just be frustrating. Do you work with some really frustrating and very annoying people? Yeah, we all do, don't we? So we're going to kind of close down by telling you how to deal with these really frustrating people. So when you start looking at identifying strategic goals for SharePoint in the next year, you actually know how to deal with them. Has anybody ever heard the phrase drive-by management? Yeah? Drive-by management is done by people who actually want you to fail. And it's a very interesting thing.
It's time for some drive-by management. Don't forget to do the thing for what's his name, or else we're dead. Must outrun cries for clarification.
So I came across a manager one time in an office who said to me, "We will get rid of open text over my dead body." And this was in a board meeting in front of a lot of people who came up and said, "You know what, we want SharePoint. We want to have SharePoint online. And we've got this on-premises open text system, and we're going to integrate with that, and you will get rid of that over my dead body." And I thought, that's interesting. And actually, there are a number of phrases you can use when you're faced with that kind of thing. And they're called magic phrases. And there are 4 of them. And there is, "That's interesting, tell me more." "That's interesting, why would you say that?" "That's interesting, why would you do that?" And "That's interesting, why would you ask that?" And these 4 phrases are the only 4 phrases you will ever need to deal with members of the reluctant populace. So this guy said to me, "We'll get rid of open text over my dead body." And I said, "That's interesting. Why would you say that?" And immediately he was like, "Well, we've spent years investing in open text. We've got a dedicated team of people who've been committed to open text for the last 3 years. We've spent, nearly £3 million putting this in." And I went, "Oh, that's interesting. Well, tell me more." And he went, well, we're really concerned that if we get rid of open text, we're going to lose our jobs." So really, what was he worried about? It wasn't getting rid of open text. It was that he was going to lose his job. And he was going to lose the control of what he described and saw really as his little own power island. So these simple phrases are a really interesting way of getting people just to elaborate on their fears and concerns to help you understand more about why they're objecting to strategic change in the business. So goal alignment's not an easy thing at all, but it's why some SharePoint projects are actually successful and some are not. And it's really about starting well and sticking to the objectives, those things that you actually need to identify upfront before you start doing SharePoint. And as we move more towards hybrid or entirely to the cloud, in fact, goals and benefits have to be intensely clear. When you get SharePoint wrong in the cloud, it's going to be damned expensive. When you signed up with a third party to deliver this stuff for you and you don't get your objectives clear up front, you don't get your goals aligned correctly, it's going to cost you an absolute fortune to decouple yourself from that provider and then work out how you're going to do this. If you outsource all of your staff because you think that you're going to get a better service from a third party and it then goes wrong and you have to insource staff back in again, you've compounded the problem by magnitudes because you decided that it was a better strategy for your company to outsource your technicians and use a third party, and then it went wrong. How many of you in this room have ever read your mobile phone contract? None of you. How many of you ever had a problem with your mobile phone provider? At least half of you. How difficult was it to decouple yourself from that mobile phone provider? So most of us end up walking away and forgetting about the contract because you can't cancel it because it's going to cost you loads of money anyway, or you buy yourself out, don't you? How's that going to work with something like SharePoint Online when you've invested maybe £3 or £4 million putting it up there? You can't easily turn it off, can you? You can't easily buy yourself out, can you? It's a different level of decision, different level of problem that you're facing, isn't it? Don't design to fail. I know this is a very difficult concept, a very high-level talk and stuff. It's designed to try and get you thinking a little bit about, well, why are we often in the weeds when we should be looking down on the SharePoint projects and programs? But if the goals are not clear to you, the measures are not identified, then you've got them platitudes we mentioned earlier. And remember, every single goal that you set incurs budget. It costs money to deliver. Have you got enough money to get the real benefits that you think you need? Or are you just going to deliver something a little bit short and bypass all the quality and control? And skills are intensely scarce at the minute in the marketplace, really hard to find. Don't be afraid of telling your boss that you haven't got the skills, you need some training, or you need to bring in some external staff to actually help you with this. But make sure you don't fall victim of the consultant speak as well at the same time. So SharePoint isn't the goal. It's a means of enabling business benefit for you to drive business change in your company. But only if you take the time out to do it in the first place. If not, then I think you need to be prepared to be in the 63% of those companies who actually don't manage to deliver their SharePoint projects successfully. And I hope you're not one of those. So we'll just finish off with one last scant word from Dilbert.
I have invested all of my self-esteem in this PowerPoint presentation. It is all that I am and all that I will be. It is a digital reckoning of my value.
Did they catch the chimp who made your slides?
Ow, ow, ow.
So, feedback is welcomed on this, but more importantly, you should be seeking feedback from the people who you're delivering your projects for to see how successful you're actually being in delivering what you do. Thank you very much.